You're looking at a copper rod pushed into plain dirt, no solar panel, no gas line, no wire running back to a meter on the side of your house, and a small light is glowing off of it. That rod cost about $8 at the hardware store. The ground did the rest. Here's the claim I want you to sit with for the next few minutes. The soil in your own backyard carries a real, measurable electric charge. Men were pulling that charge out of the earth to run machines 180 years ago, long before the power company ever mailed you a bill, and the Amish families I came to know never fully let go of that idea. They kept living close to the ground while the rest of us got wired into a system we now cannot switch off. The first time I stood in a workshop outside Millersburg, Ohio, I watched an old man run a small charge off 2 metal stakes driven into the dirt floor of his barn. I spent a solid 20 minutes waiting for the trick. Waiting for the hidden battery, there was no trick. And before we are done here, I am going to show you a patent filed in 1875, a real document with a real number that spells out how to make this work in the yard of a house you already own. You do not need to build a new home. You need what is already under your feet. Now let me back up, because I was the biggest skeptic you ever met. I spent 30-some years doing everything the conventional way. I paid the electric bill without reading it. I trusted that the men who designed the grid knew best, and that if there were a cheaper, simpler way to keep a light on, somebody would have told me. I believed that. Right up until I started spending real time in Amish country, first around Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, then out in Holmes County, Ohio, and what I saw there did not match a single thing I had been told about how power is supposed to work. I will be honest with you, my first reaction was not wonder, it was suspicion. I figured these were quaint old ways, charming but useless, the kind of thing you nod along to politely and then forget on the drive home. I was a man who had paid an electric company every month for decades without blinking. I was sure that if there were a better way, my utility would have found it, patented it, and sold it back to me. It took me a long time and a lot of quiet watching to understand that the reason I had never heard of any of this was not because it did not work. It was because nobody makes money teaching you to need them less. Because here is the thing nobody explains to you. Electricity is not something that only exists inside wires and wall outlets. The earth itself is electric. There are slow, natural currents moving through the ground under your lawn at this very moment. Scientists have a name for them. They call them telluric currents, and they are not a theory. They have been measured, mapped, and even used. Let me give you the moment in history that proves it beyond any argument. On the 1st and 2nd of September, in the year 1859, the sun threw a massive solar storm at the Earth. We call it the Carrington event now. It slammed into the planet and lit up the sky with auroras so bright that people saw them over Cuba and Hawaii. And here is the part they leave out of the school books. Along the telegraph lines from Boston to Portland, the current in the ground got so strong that the operators unhooked their batteries completely. They pulled the power out of their own machines. And they kept sending messages anyway for about 2 hours, running on nothing but the electricity flowing through the earth itself. Sit with that. Grown men, professional operators, disconnected every battery they owned and the wires stayed alive. The ground was doing the work. That is not a legend passed down around a fire. That is documented history from 1859, written down by the men who watch their equipment, throw sparks, and keep running. And it was not a one-time freak of nature, either. Those telluric currents in the ground flow every single day, storm or no storm. The solar storm of 1859 just cranked them up loud enough that nobody could ignore them for a couple of hours. The rest of the time they are quieter, slower, always moving through the soil beneath your grass, between wet ground and dry ground, between one mineral layer and the next. Surveyors and geologists still measure them today when they hunt for ore and water underground. The current is real. The only thing that ever changed is that we stopped paying attention to it. I remember standing in that barn outside Millersburg, thinking about those Boston telegraph men from 1859, and it hit me like a cold splash of water. Everything I had ever been taught about electricity started at a power plant. Not one teacher, not one utility man, not one salesman ever once mentioned that the ground itself was humming with current the whole time. It was not that they lied to me exactly. It was that a whole category of knowledge had simply been left out. like a page torn quietly from a book, and I never even knew the page was missing until I was standing on a dirt floor in Ohio at 50-some years old. So the question that started eating at me was simple. If the Earth carried enough current to run a telegraph across New England with the batteries unplugged, why is not a single one of us using that ground under our own homes? Why did that knowledge just quietly disappear? That question is what this whole video is about. Stay with me, because the answer involves a Kentucky farmer, a patent office, and a technique so simple you could set it up this weekend with parts from any hardware store. But first, let me show you how this actually works, because once you understand it, you will never look at your backyard the same way again. Go back to the year 1841. A Scottish inventor named Alexander Bain took two pieces of metal, one copper and one zinc, and he buried them in ordinary damp ground about a yard apart. He ran a wire between them, and that plain dirt produced a current, roughly 1 volt, pulled straight out of the earth, with no fuel, no fire, and no moving parts. Bain was not doing magic. He had built what we now call an earth battery. Here is why it works, in plain English. When you put two different metals into moist soil, they do not just sit there. Zinc gives up its electrons more easily than copper does. The soil, once it is damp, is full of tiny charged particles called ions, and that turns the dirt into what a chemist calls an electrolyte. It becomes the wet middle of a battery. The zinc starts letting go of electrons, the copper collects them, and because the two metals are not touching, those electrons have only one path to travel. They have to run up the wire you connected between them. Electrons moving through a wire is the exact definition of electricity. That is all a battery ever is. Two different metals and something wet and salty in between. You have already seen a version of this if you ever stuck 2 nails in a lemon or a potato in grade school and lit up a tiny bulb. The lemon was just the wet, acidic middle. Well, the earth under your feet is the biggest, most patient lemon you will ever own. It never runs out the way a lemon does because rain keeps recharging the moisture and the ground is enormous. Let me put that difference in plain terms, because it matters more than people realize. A lemon dies in a day. A potato dries out in a week. A store-bought battery goes flat and heads to the landfill. But the ground does not quit. Every rain refills the moisture. Every season the microbes keep feeding. The soil is not a small sealed cell you use up and throw away. It is a living, self-refilling system the size of your whole property. That is exactly why the old telegraph men could lean on it, and why a modern homesteader can too. You are not draining a tank. You are tapping a spring. And here is something the Amish understood in their bones long before any of us put words to it. The value of a power source is not only how much it makes, it is whether it can be taken away from you. A tank of propane runs dry and you have to buy more. A power line can be cut by an ice storm, or the price can be doubled by a company you never voted for. But the current in the ground under your own feet cannot be shut off by anybody, cannot be metered by anybody, and cannot be priced by anybody. In a world where every other source of power comes with a bill and a master, that changes the entire equation. Now, one Earth cell only makes about a volt, sometimes less, sometimes a little more depending on your soil. That is a real limitation, and I am not going to lie to you about it. But here is the part that gets interesting. You can wire these cells together the same way the old-timers wired them, the same way the batteries in your truck are built. Connect the copper of one cell to the zinc of the next over and over, and the voltage adds up. String them side by side instead, and the current adds up. This is not exotic. This is exactly how a 12-volt battery is really 6 little cells stacked in a row. The Earth battery follows the identical rule. And this is where it stops being a science fair toy and starts being something a self-reliant family can actually use. Because you do not need 120 volts to matter. You need enough to charge a small bank, keep a radio alive, run a string of low-voltage lights in a root cellar, or keep a phone breathing when the grid goes dark. Low, steady, and free beats high and metered when the ice storm hits and everybody else on your road is sitting in the cold. So, the science is real, the history is real, and the cost is almost nothing. Which brings us straight to the part that made my blood pressure go up. Because if this is real, and it is, somebody had to make sure you never heard about it. Let me introduce you to the men who wrote it down before it got buried. On the 23rd of February, 1875, a man named James C. Bryan of Philadelphia was granted United States patent number 160,152 for a device he called, plainly, an earth battery. This is not internet folklore. It is a real, numbered patent in the records of the United States Patent Office. And Bryan did something clever that most people who play with these have never tried. He wrote that if you partly pack the metal plates in sulfur so the dampness of the ground reacts against them, you get a stronger, steadier current. He even described orienting the plates in the ground along a north and south line to line up with the natural currents already flowing through the earth. 10 years later, in 1885, another inventor named George Diekman received United States patent number 329,724 for his own improved electric earth battery. So this was not one lonely crank with a strange idea. This was a chain of serious men filing serious patents, decade after decade, all describing the same buried truth: that the ground makes power and you can harvest it. So what happened? Why is there not an earth battery in every homestead in America? Follow the money, the way I finally learned to. In those same decades, an entire industry was being built on the opposite idea, on central power plants, on copper wire strung to every house, on a meter on your wall that counts every single unit you use and sends you a bill for it. There is no meter you can attach to the dirt in a man's own backyard. There is no monthly charge for the current that the ground gives away for free. A power source with no fuel, no wire from a plant, and no meter is a power source that nobody can bill you for. And a thing nobody can bill you for is a thing that certain people would much rather you never think about. And here is the part that really gets under my skin, because it shows they knew the earth conducts electricity, and they used it, they just made sure it worked for them and not for you. There is a system the power companies run in rural country all over the world called single wire earth return. Instead of stringing 2 wires out to a far-off farm, they string 1 wire and they let the earth itself carry the current back. 1 wire out, the ground for the return trip. It saves them a fortune in copper. They have been doing it for 100 years. So the same industry that never once told you the ground makes power has been quietly using the ground as half of their own circuit the entire time. They trust the earth to carry their electricity across miles of countryside. They just never wanted you thinking about what that means for the dirt in your own backyard. I am not asking you to believe in some grand conspiracy with a name and an address. I am asking you to notice something simpler and honestly more insulting. The knowledge was never made illegal. It was just never mentioned. It was allowed to gather dust in the patent archive while 100 million Americans grew up believing the only place electricity comes from is a wire on a pole. The Amish did not fall for that, because the Amish never handed their independence to a company in the first place. They kept asking the old question, what can I do myself with what I already have that no man can take away or shut off? That question is worth more than any patent, and it leads us to the man who took this the furthest. His name was Nathan Stubblefield, and he was a melon farmer from Murray, Kentucky. Not a professor, not a corporate engineer, a dirt under the fingernails farmer. And in the 1890s, this Kentucky farmer was doing things with the earth's electricity that the experts of his day could barely explain. He filed for a patent in October of 1896, and on the 9th of March, 1898, he was granted United States patent number 600,457 for an electrical battery. His design was a coil of iron and insulated copper wire that he immersed in liquid ore, and this is the key, buried directly in the ground. He was pulling continuous current out of the Kentucky soil. He used it to power his experiments in wireless communication, sending voices without wires years before most people had ever heard the word radio. Think about who this man was. A farmer, working alone, out in a field, coaxing usable electricity out of the plain dirt with copper and iron. And the state of Kentucky knew what they had in him. In 1991, the governor of Kentucky, Wallace Wilkinson, issued an official proclamation honoring Nathan Stubblefield's work. Almost 100 years after the fact, the state put it in writing. And still, almost nobody in America has ever heard his name. A farmer solved a problem that the utility companies profit from you never solving, and his story got left out of every classroom in the country. Now I want to stop right here because this is the exact spot where I know some of you are pulling back. Now, if you already own a house and you are sitting there thinking this only applies to people building an off-grid cabin from scratch, stay with me because this next part is specifically for you. Everything I have described works in the yard of a home that is already standing. It does not care how old your house is. In fact, if your home was built before 1980, you likely have something newer homes do not, which is real, open ground around you. A yard, a garden bed, a spot behind the barn or the shed where the soil stays a little damp. That is all the earth battery needs. You are not tearing into a wall. You are not calling a contractor. You are not touching your home's existing electrical system at all. This lives entirely outside, in the dirt, completely separate from anything the grid connects to. I want to sit on this for a moment because I know how many of you have been burned before. You have seen the flashy off-grid promises that turn out to need a $40,000 system, a new roof, or a house you have not built yet. You have watched younger folks tell you to just start over, as if a man in his 60s is going to bulldoze the home he raised his family in. That is not what this is. This is the opposite of that. The older your place, the more ground you probably have, and ground is the only raw material that matters here. A man on 2 acres with a 50-year-old farmhouse is in a better position to do this than a young couple in a brand new house squeezed onto a slab with a postage stamp of grass. For once in your life, being the one with the older place and the bigger yard is the advantage, not the handicap. The system rewards exactly what you already own. Here is a setup a man with a home he already owns can put together this weekend. You go to the hardware store and you buy a few copper rods or copper pipe and a few galvanized rods, which are just steel coated in zinc. Galvanized is your zinc, copper is your copper. You pick a spot in the yard where the ground holds moisture, near a downspout, along a garden bed, in the low part of the yard where the rain sits. You drive a copper rod into the ground, and about a foot to a yard away you drive a galvanized rod. You connect a wire from one to the other, and right there you have your first cell, making close to a volt. Then you repeat it, cell after cell, and you wire them in series so the voltage stacks. Copper to zinc, down the line. Keep the ground around them damp because moisture is the whole game. Dry dirt makes almost nothing. Wet dirt makes a battery. The old-timers figured this out the hard way, and it is the single most important thing most beginners get wrong. A patch of consistently moist, rich soil will outproduce a big patch of dry sand every time. Now, a few practical things I learned the hard way so you do not have to. First, get yourself a cheap voltmeter. They run about $15, and it is the only way to actually see what your setup is doing. Touch the 2 leads to your first cell and you will see that needle jump. And I promise you, watching that number move for the first time off 2 stakes in your own yard does something to a man. It makes it real in a way no video ever will. Second, the further apart your 2 metals sit, up to about a yard, the better, because it gives the soil room to do its work between them. Push them too close together and you choke the reaction. Third, deeper is usually better than shallow, because the moisture stays more steady down where the sun cannot bake it out. And when it comes to actually using the power, you do not run your gadget straight off the rods. The current is slow and steady, more like a trickle than a gush. So you let it trickle into a small storage bank, a capacitor, or a small rechargeable battery, and you let it fill up over hours the way a slow spring fills a bucket overnight. Then you draw from the full bucket when you need it. That is the piece most folks miss. The earth battery is not a sprinter. It is a patient, tireless worker that fills your reserve a little at a time, day and night, in rain and in dark, whether you are watching it or not. And a source that never sleeps and never sends a bill adds up to a great deal more than you would think over a week, a month, a winter. Now, if that soil goes bone dry in July, the current fades. And that used to be the deal breaker. So let me hand you the trick the Amish never forgot, the one that solves it for pennies. This is what I want you to remember even if you forget everything else in this video. But before I give you that, I want to make sure you understand what you are actually holding here. What I just walked you through, the rods, the spacing, the moisture, the wiring in series, that is one single technique out of an entire archive of this kind of knowledge, and it is honestly one of the simpler ones. Over the years spent with these families and digging through these old documents, I pulled together the whole collection into something I call the Complete Field Vault. It is a 3-volume set of the suppressed Amish home formulas, the heating systems that need no furnace, the cooling methods that need no electric bill, the pantry and food keeping methods, the natural pest control, and the off-grid power tricks like the one you are learning right now. There is a special limited time offer on it as I am putting this out, so if getting back the rest of this buried knowledge matters to you, the link is in the description below and you can scan the QR code on your screen. I will not push it beyond that because what I want to give you next is worth staying for. Because here is that moisture trick, and it is so simple you are going to be a little angry nobody told you. The Amish and the old farmers before them kept the ground moist in the driest months using a buried, unglazed clay pot, an old technique, thousands of years old, sometimes called an olla. You take a simple clay pot, the kind that has not been sealed with glaze, you plug the drainage hole, you bury it in the ground up to its neck right in the middle of your earth cells, and you fill it with water and cover the top. Because the clay is porous, the water seeps out slowly, for days, keeping the surrounding soil damp exactly where your rods are. No pump, no hose running, no electricity to move the water, one clay pot, refilled every few days, keeps your earth battery alive through a dry spell. The same trick they use to water tomatoes in a drought, quietly doing double duty to keep the current flowing. That alone will put you ahead of 99% of the people who ever tried this and gave up when their soil dried out. But I promised you a finale. I promised you something from the research that will genuinely surprise you, something you have almost certainly never heard, and I do not break promises. So here it is. For a long time, the earth battery had a ceiling nobody could break, a little over a volt per cell, and a weak trickling current. That is why it got dismissed as a toy. But the reason has finally been understood, and understanding it changes everything, because the fix costs you almost nothing. Modern university researchers took a hard, honest look at what actually generates the electricity in soil, and they found something the old inventors sensed but could not name. It is not only the metal, it is what is alive in the dirt. There are bacteria living in your soil, real living organisms, that scientists call exoelectrogenic bacteria. That is a big word for a simple, astonishing thing. These are microbes that breathe by releasing electrons, the same way you and I breathe by taking in oxygen. As they eat the organic matter in rich soil, they push electrons out into their surroundings. In one careful study, researchers gathered 7 different soils and ran them continuously for 270 days, watching them generate electricity and mapping which living bacteria produce the most current. The dirt was not just a wet sponge. The dirt was alive, and the life in it was making power. Then, researchers at Wageningen University, one of the top agricultural research centers in the world, took the next step. They combined living plants with these soil microbes in what they call a plant microbial fuel cell. The living roots feed the bacteria release electrons, and you harvest the current, all while the plant just keeps on growing. In a rice paddy field, they measured a steady, continuous output all through the wet part of the growing season, averaging around 6.5 milliwatts for every square meter of plant growth. Out in a salt marsh, the numbers climbed higher still, and they logged a record output for this kind of technology. Their working systems produce in the neighborhood of 0.4 of a watt per square meter of growing plants. Living soil, feeding living microbes, producing measurable electricity, season after season, with the plants never harmed at all. Read those numbers and understand what they mean. This is not a fringe claim from some forgotten crank. This is a modern, respected university in a laboratory, confirming with hard measurements exactly what a Kentucky melon farmer sensed in his field in 1898. And this is the piece that gave me chills, standing back in that Ohio barn thinking it over. The Amish never ran a microbial fuel cell study, they never used the words exoelectrogenic bacteria, but their whole way of life is built on the exact same truth those scientists proved, that living soil is not dirt to be paved over and forgotten, that the ground is a working, breathing partner if you feed it and tend it instead of poisoning it. They kept the soil alive with compost and manure and rest, generation after generation, for reasons of the harvest. And it turns out the very same living, black, crumbling soil that grows the best food also carries the strongest current. The men who honored the ground were sitting on the answer the whole time. Now, put the two halves together, the old and the new, and you get the secret. The old patents were circling without knowing it. James Bryan, back in 1875, wrote that packing his plates in the right material boosted the current. He was right, but he thought it was only chemistry. What he was actually doing, without the words for it, was building a richer, more active environment around his metal. And the modern research proves the finale technique, the one thing that turns a weak earth battery into a genuinely useful one. You do not bury your rods in plain, dead, sandy dirt. You bury them in the richest, most alive soil you can make. Finished compost, the dark, crumbly, living stuff from the bottom of a compost pile or a worm bin. That soil is packed with the exoelectrogenic bacteria doing the real work. In fact, one engineering study found that when they built their earth battery in vermicompost, which is simply soil that worms have digested, and paired a steel anode with a graphite cathode instead of plain copper, the voltage and the current both jumped up dramatically compared to ordinary dirt. Read that again. Worm-digested compost, a steel rod, and a piece of graphite. That is it. Every one of those is either free or costs a few dollars. So here is your finale, the whole thing in one breath. Take a plain plastic tub or dig a bed. Fill it with living compost, the richest you have, kept damp with your buried clay pot. Drive in your galvanized steel rod as the negative side. And for the positive side, instead of copper, use a graphite rod, which you can pull for free out of the center of an old lantern battery, or buy for a couple of dollars. Wire your cells in series to stack the voltage, and now you are not just running a chemical reaction between two metals, you are farming electricity from the billions of living microbes in that compost, the same way Wageningen does it in their laboratories, the same way that Kentucky farmer sensed it in his field 120 years ago. The dirt is not the battery. The life in the dirt is the battery, and once you feed it, it feeds you back. That is the piece that was missing for 180 years. Alexander Bain had the metals in 1841, James Bryan had the patent in 1875, Nathan Stubblefield had the courage to bury it in his own Kentucky field in 1898. But none of them had the last piece, the understanding that the soil itself is alive and that a richer, living soil makes a stronger battery. The old-timers preserved the practice. The Amish preserved the mindset, the refusal to depend on a wire from a pole. And modern researchers, almost by accident, finally explained why it all works. Now you have all three pieces at once, in your hands, in one sitting. The knowledge existed. It was left to gather dust while you paid your bill every month. But it was never actually lost, and now it is yours. Let me be straight with you, the way a good neighbor should be. This will not run your whole house tomorrow. Nobody is heating a farmhouse off 2 rods in the mud. But that was never the real point, and deep down you know it. The point is that the ground under your feet was making electricity this whole time, for free, and you were never told. The point is that a melon farmer with no fancy education pulled current out of the Kentucky dirt while the rest of the country was being taught that power only comes from a company. The point is that independence, real independence, starts the very first time you make even 1 volt that no man on earth can meter, bill, or shut off. That first glowing light off a copper rod in your own yard changes something in how you see everything else. That is the feeling I want you to hold on to. Not the size of it, the direction of it. You just took back a piece of something that was quietly taken from you and your father and his father before him. A whole way of thinking that says the earth provides, and a man who understands the earth is never fully at anyone's mercy. If you're the kind of person who believes that real, useful knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect somebody else's profit, then you already understand exactly why a video like this matters and exactly what to do next. So let me ask you something specific, and I really do want your answer. Are you going to try the copper and galvanized rods first, the simple version, or are you going straight for the finale, the living compost with the graphite rod? Tell me in the comments below, right now, which one you are starting with and what kind of soil you have got in your yard, because your dirt matters more than you think. I read these and I answer. This audience does not speak up enough, so I am asking you directly. Leave the comment, and if you want to keep recovering this kind of knowledge, the practical, buried, hand-me-down wisdom that the utility companies and the catalog stores would rather you forget, then subscribe and stand with the rest of us, who are digging it back up, one forgotten technique at a time. This is not about a channel, it is about a whole movement of people quietly taking their independence back. Because next time, I am going to show you how those same Amish families keep a room cool through an August heat wave with no electric bill and no air conditioner at all, using nothing but the temperature that already exists a few feet below your lawn. It is sitting right under you at this very moment, and once you see how simple it is, you are going to wonder the same thing I did. How did we ever forget this? I will see you in that one.